Hi, everyone. I'm Jill Itoro, Editor-in-Chief of SC Media and Editorial Director at Cyber Risk Alliance. Thanks for joining us for today's Cybercast, brought to us by Seclore, where IDC Analyst Frank Dickson will share how to deploy data-centric security quickly and easily. Frank is the Program Vice President at IDC, and he will also be joined today by Vishal Gupta, founder and CEO of Seclore. With that, I am going to turn it on over to you, Frank.
Fantastic. And hey, let me extend my welcome to you today. Vishal and I are pretty thrilled here. We've got a pretty packed agenda. I'm certain you're going to get a lot of value out of what we see today. I'm going to start off with a little bit of context, right? Because sometimes we jump so deep into the trees, right in the middle of the forest, we forget the bigger picture. And so let me develop a little context as we start talking about this whole topic of data security, right? Because IDC characterizes this as a third platform. We kind of got the second platform where it was all about computing. And as we move into this third platform, right, it's all about digital transformation. It's all about how do we inject technology into our processes to either deliver transparency at scale or empathy at scale or create efficiencies, right? And the first part of these waves of digital transformation was all about these new technologies, these new delivery models, things like cloud and mobile and social and big data. And if you look at where we are now in this platforms and community phase, like this is kind of the era we call multiplied innovation, right? There's very few tasks that knowledge workers do within the enterprise that doesn't involve technology. I mean, this isn't any secret. You know, currently our IT environments are growing more and more connected every day, and the democratization of IT is rampant. You know, we can access our work from anywhere, and you know, no point about this is more apparent than now as we talk about this COVID, where we're talking more about remote work and hybrid work. And, you know, what is the impact of all this? It's data, right? It's lots and lots of data. But what is this? What is the scale of this data? Well, the scale of this data is actually increasing exponentially, right? Because if you think about, you know, the time of day and where we are in the world, right? COVID is the story of the day. And COVID didn't slow our digital transformation. Quite frankly, it accelerated it. And if we didn't think that we were going to be involved in digital acceleration before COVID, we certainly are now, right? And, you know, as we look at the data, almost half had zero impact from COVID, and 34% actually accelerated their digital transformation initiatives. You know, and so as we look at what we're spending on this digital transformation pre-COVID and post-COVID, what we're noticing is that digital transformation keeps moving and moving and moving, and it's all about, you know, delivering efficiencies and experiences, right? But fundamentally, it's all about data. The fuel of digital transformation is data. Well, how much data, right? So this is a slide I love, right? One of the nice things about being part of IDC is there's a lot of smart people doing a lot of great research. And quite frankly, I stole this, right? It's actually my boss's slide, but don't tell him. So as we look at how much data there is, right, in 2020, we estimate that 59 zettabytes of data was created, right? And if you think about this data, it makes sense. Streaming video, audio, this conference, this webcast itself, it being delivered to your endpoint right now is all about data. And if we think about not just how much data is created, but if we think of how much data is stored, you know, that's 4.2 zettabytes worth of data globally. That's a lot of data. So as we look at this, and clearly, you know, one of the things that now is as we're creating all this data, we're seeing more and more that what matters to enterprises as we move into this future state of reality is that as we talk to CEOs, you know, their emphasis now reflects this whole data movement. And so you're seeing this prioritization, right? On top, you'll notice everybody's prioritizing digital business operations right now. Why? because of COVID, right? We're trying to make sure that we maintain our revenue streams. But you look down there, what is number 3 in the list of the CEO's agenda? It's digital trust programs. What's 4? It's data programs, right? We're identifying that not only is data the core of creating efficiencies, but it's also a vector that we need to instill trust. And so as we think of the ramifications of these decisions, let's walk through it. So what does data mean to you, right? We talked about this. 59 zettabytes of data was created in 2020. We're estimating that there's a compound annual growth rate of 26% to result in 143 new zettabytes by 2024 created annually. And as we continue on thinking of this, 89% of the 59 zettabytes of volume is generated by replication and distribution, right? Creating these massive data libraries. 63% of this data will be created on endpoints, 12% at the edge, leaving 25% of the core. 20% of the global data sphere will be processed by the cloud. Your data is everywhere. And so as we look at this, then 20% of this new data created by 2020 will be real time, forecasted to grow by 20 to 24% by 2025, and case in point. And this brings all this data that we're dealing with. 95% of organizations are integrating up to 6 different data types coming from 10 different data technologies. Now, as we look at all this data, it doesn't all need to be protected. A lot of it does. All right, about 50% of all data requires some level of protection. And as we look at that, and here's the case in point, 50% requires some level of protection, but only 52% of that actually is protected, right? We have not only a data problem, but a data security problem. And it's not just that we're not protecting enough data, we're not doing it accurately, all right? And I think that's one of the key points that as we go through this webcast that we're going to hit on later. So as we look at the different types of data, there's some data that we call internal or confidential, right? It's not data that's critical to our business operations, but it's just data that we would rather not get out. And as we look at that data, we see that about 23% of that data actually needs to be protected, but we're protecting 10 to 12% more than we actually need to protect. So there's an accuracy issue. There's some data that doesn't need to be protected that is being protected. And then we look at that secret data, that data that's critical to our business operations, that data that we don't want our competitors to know. What we see is, hey, we're protecting a lot less than we actually need to protect. And so it's not just about protecting data, it's about protecting data accuracy. It's about protecting the right data. I mean, think about it. Honestly, in your organization, how often do you find that documents or PDFs that are available on your public website for download, let's call it marketing collateral, how often is it protected internally, right? There's an accuracy issue. And so as we look at as we talk to CISOs and data security professionals, which of the areas of your data, compliance program need the most additional resources, we're finding that CISOs are saying, this issue of data security is a big problem. It's the number one issue, in trying to adhere to data privacy compliance. But none of these other things will surprise you. Data monitoring, number 2, data classification, number 3, right? All of these issues associated with data are big and important. And what we're saying is, hey, CISOs are saying we need help in protecting data. And what do they need help with? Well, we asked, which of the following features do you consider the most important in a data privacy management solution, right? Data flow capabilities, DSARs, data subject access request forms, incident response, data mapping, right? There's a whole plethora of feature sets. They're asking for help, and there's a lot of things they need help with. And so if we need help, and if we don't have enough people to get it done, and there's a whole lot of tasks to get done, well, how do we approach that? Well, I think the obvious answer is going to be automation. And so when we look at some of these recurring themes from our last directions presentations, we talk about, a lot of these themes of things being independent and dynamic and augmented and self-regulating and contactless. And what is the theme that we get throughout these macro themes that we talk about what's driving technology? It's automation, right? We don't necessarily associate the name automation, but automation is how we get that done. And automation isn't new, right? We've been dealing with automation for quite some time. What's new is this need to employ that automation at scale. And what larger scale do we have than the scale of data? Remember, we start off this conversation talking about we're creating 59 zettabytes of data globally. But what are the barriers, right? What are the barriers to creating value from automations, right? There's challenges with integration, right? There's challenges with metrics. There's challenges with skills and a scarcity of availability. But what IDC is saying is that, IT automation is the thing of this year. And so there's a lot of areas that we're looking to automate in 2021 and 2022. And, we'll see these, right? We're going to be, branch end user provisioning, IT asset support, network endpoint security, infrastructure. But of all of these things that we're talking about automating, what's number one? What's the big topic? Well, as we ask, people in our surveys, it's data protection. It's data management. Why? Because it's one of the most acute areas that is ripe for automation. So with that, like kind of setting that problem up and I think I've done a great job of articulating the problem and the size of the scope and what we need to do. Let me pass this to Vishal, because I'm certain he's got opinions on how we solve this problem associated with automation.
Thanks, Frank. I think that's a great setup, and we are seeing almost all the findings that you have that you've presented in the last 10-15 minutes. We are seeing this on the ground, and what I wanted to do is from your high level context, I wanted to get to the other end, which is right down to the weeds, right? Of running through 3 examples of situations that we've seen with very, very large enterprises, large global enterprises, and what was the problems with data protection, and then how does automation come in and solve those problems, right? So the first example I want to take is of a large financial services company, one of the largest in the world, Fortune 10, I think, right, 100,000 people plus company. And you mentioned COVID, and one of the problems that it introduces, besides people working from home, is that nearly every piece of enterprise data was also going home. And every enterprise, and definitely this one that I'm talking about, was finding it very, very difficult to extend every enterprise security control from networks to devices to applications and so on to people working from home. And just as an example, I remember when we first talked to this enterprise, just their DLP system alone was generating just short of 1 million alerts a day, right? And that requires more people than exists with that kind of a skill in the world, probably, right? The first earlier attempts, which is the non-automated attempts, were exactly to extend the same set of security controls to people working out of home. So there were device level controls, you extend that to personal devices. There were network level controls, you extend that to personal networks and VPNs and so on. And there were application controls which were extended also to home workers. And it became a very difficult exercise to look at every security privacy control and then be able to extend that to a person working from home on his personal computer, personal network, and so on. And then the second thing is the employing armies of people to manage DLP alerts and then to reflect that back into the DLP policies. Right? It was an impossible task, which became worse every day. And what automation did in this particular case is that with the data-centric approach, what the enterprise was able to do is embed security policies into the data itself. And so, in some sense, let the data go wherever it needs to go, as long as the data itself carries with it its own security and privacy policies. Then the data can go home, it can go to the cloud, it can go to unmanaged cloud, it can go to the public website of the company for all that the company cares, because the security was data-centric. And the second thing on the DLP alerts is that the DLP system before this automation had only two choices. Either it would let the email go, or it would stop the email and start a process for approval of that email and so on, right? And a million of these happening every day was nearly impossible to manage. So with this automation, what happened is that the DLP system was now able to automatically embed these security policies into that document or email and let it go. And so the number of events or the number of alerts came down from just short of 1 million to about 6,000 a day, which is still a lot, but it's a fraction of the number of alerts that the enterprise was seeing prior, right? And going back, Frank, just the value of this automation, it is virtually impossible to manage 1 million DLP alerts. And this is just from the email component a day. Reducing and then being able to manage this whole thing through automation was almost the only option for the enterprise. Otherwise, relying on people to do this was nearly impossible. The second example I want to take is one of the largest materials research and development company and fabrication. And in their case, there was a lot of collaboration of highly confidential intellectual property that was happening with the enterprise value chain. So the company receives a lot of intellectual property from its customers and shares a lot of the intellectual property with vendors and partners used for fabrication. Right? And in this process, the company wanted, as a part of the digital transformation, the company wanted to open up its cloud services, Microsoft 365, Box, and the likes, so that customers and partners and vendors could start using the same service that the enterprise is using it for collaboration. Right. Again, this looks like a very common a situation that nearly every enterprise deals with every day. But if you go back with this information being highly confidential, legal liability and non-disclosure agreement and clauses being governing this kind of information, it becomes a very complex process. Right? And the only option for the enterprise was to effectively block these cloud services from being accessed by the enterprise value chain. Right? So even though the enterprise was using Microsoft's 365 and Box and so on, these same systems, which are very good systems for collaboration with external agencies, just could not be used because security and privacy became a big concern. With automation, what was possible is, and with security being embedded into the data itself, now this data can go to this cloud service. From the cloud service, it could be downloaded by a fabricator in Taiwan, for example, and the compliance to non-disclosure agreements and liability clauses was inbuilt into the data. So the data, for example, could be self-destructed if, for example, a non-disclosure agreement clause was actually implemented. Right? And the CASB system in this case was able to automatically apply security policies to data which was being uploaded into the Microsoft 365 cloud in this particular case. Right? And there are hundreds, thousands of folders and SharePoint libraries and Teams chats and so on. And for a person to be able to do this job is virtually impossible. Right? But with the combination of data-centric security with CASB, this job was automated and therefore any confidential information going to the cloud or to an external agency was automatically protected. The last, but not the least, is a very large business conglomerate. And in their case, they had two big repositories of information: the ERP system, which was almost a central repository for all structured data, the database kind of data, and an ECM system, which was the central repository for all kinds of unstructured information. And with more and more centralization, it also created a central point of failure for the enterprise. So if one of these two systems got compromised, then all the data of the enterprise was available to the public. The biggest challenge over there was how do you replicate security policies that have been embedded in the ERP system on data that is going outside of the ERP system. So for example, in the ERP system, if general ledger data only the CFO and the finance team can access, this policy was only applicable to data while it is within the ERP system. But somebody could just press a button, download a report, and then all these security controls were out of the window. Right? Similar challenges with the ECM system. Right? And what it ended up becoming was a data chase. Right? So the enterprise had to track the data when it was downloaded from the ERP system and made sure that every system had the same security policy as the original ERP system, which said general ledger data is only available to the CFO. Now, again, with data-centric security and automation, what was possible is that the ERP and the EACM system's security policies got embedded into the data before it left that system. So before a report containing general ledger data could be downloaded from the ERP system, it was protected such that this downloaded report can also now only be accessed by the CFO and the finance team. And this is virtually impossible to be done by humans at any scale, right? It means educating thousands of people on how to make the right security decisions. And with automation and a data-centric security model, it was possible to replicate all these security policies that the enterprise had built over years onto data.
Vishal, it's interesting. The one thing I would say, as you looked at your case studies, right? Mm-hmm. The interesting thing about the case studies is they're completely binary. It's not about doing this or that. It's doing this or nothing at all. Like when you look at the materials company, like when you can take all your intellectual property for a company and download it onto a USB drive and walk it out the door, the answer to that is the only way to protect that data is not to share it at all. So now what you do is hamstring the productivity of your entire organization. It's not what solution will work better. Automation is the only solution. When you talked about 1 million alerts a day, I don't care how big you are. There's no company on the face of the planet that can answer 1 million alerts a day. And so essentially what you're doing is if you don't use automation, you're simply got everything in monitor mode because you can't block a mode. Can you imagine if you blocked half of those? How do you respond at the help desk to 500,000 blocks a day? You can't do it. And your last solution, once again, it's binary. It's you either secure it or you don't with automation, or you don't. But there's no middle ground. You can't do this manually. It's a zero alternative, correct?
Absolutely. So what was happening was in all of these cases was that the enterprise actually, like the materials research company, they just stopped the vendors and fabricators from accessing their cloud systems, right? And so it's kind of back to the Stone Ages where if the company had to send any confidential information to a vendor, the only way to do it, and believe it or not, this was actually being done, was to take printouts, mark it as confidential, and have a person get on a flight from the US to Taiwan and hand it over physically. This was the method. And we are not talking 1920s. This was a method till 2019. Right. This is
the only alternative. Yeah, absolutely. It's automation. It's either, like I say, in some of these instances, and I love these scenarios, it's binary. You either do this with automation or you don't do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that is why automation has in some sense allowed data protection to go wider. Earlier, what was happening in this space, in the data protection space, is that it was a very specific use case for a very limited period of time. So if there is a very large merger or acquisition that is happening and there are 50 people involved in that M&A conversation, then in those kind of very motivated set of people were able to use this kind of technology without automation. But the use of the technology remained in this very, very specific scenario till automation came around. Right? So absolutely, the option at scale is do nothing, pray, those kind of options. Absolutely. So the data protection or data-centric security is not, as a concept, is not new. And in the first versions of security, which was data-centric, go as far back as 20 years plus ago. But the biggest challenge in this space has been, how do you get end users and security administrators, and you're running out of skills on the security front, you're running out of skills to be able to do this. How do you get them to make these decisions? Right? The simplest example is deciding even what to protect. Frank, you had mentioned that a lot of the data enterprises create needs protection, but who makes that decision? Right? And the answer earlier has been the end users, the person who's creating a document or an email or getting on a Teams chat or any of these. That is the person who makes a decision. Right? So that's one option. The second option is that the security administrator makes a decision that all board communication is confidential, or any email that the CFO sends to the external legal counsel is confidential, and so on. So these were the only two options, right? Either the person who's creating the communication or a central security team makes that decision. And both of these have lots of challenges. The end users are just not equipped to make security decisions on the fly, and the amount of training and enablement that is required for even 1,000 people company is impossible to get. And centralized security teams just do not have enough context to be able to make a decision of what kind of security is required. Right? And what automation has done is this combination of discovery and rights management and data-centric audits is that the automation has removed that decision from being taken by the end user. Right? So now, as soon as a document or an email is created, a system is able to make that decision based on either a set of rules and policies, which has been the case historically, or machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies, which is more the norm now. And just carrying forward the same thing, deciding what security to apply. Right? Should Frank be allowed to edit this document, make copies of it? When do these policies change? Right? What happens if somebody leaves the company or a organization restructuring happens, and so on? And then data-centric technologies, security technologies also create a lot of data-centric audits, right? So you can actually track what happens to every piece of data through its life cycle. But making sense of that information, I mean, it's just so much data that it means no information comes out of it. All of these were manual tasks. And fast forward today is that all of these tasks have been automated, and therefore this technology is now ready to be deployed prime time and at scale. I mean, I'll give you an example. Seclore itself, and we are one of the leaders in the space, we track north of 20 billion pieces of protected data with just the system that we have. Right? And that comes nowhere to the 89 zettabyte, I think, of data that is created. So we're nowhere close to that, but we are getting there. Right? So I think what is happening on the ground, what we are seeing on the ground, is that there is a constant data chase that is inhibiting digital transformation, right? The need for an enterprise to chase the data when it goes home, goes to the cloud, goes to an external agency, goes to a personal device, and so on. And that data chase is taking away attention from the true power of digital transformation. What can it do? Data-centric security is helping enterprises to not constantly chase the data as it goes around, and to help protect and track the data. And the last but not the least is automation is bringing this technology to scale. It is overcoming adoption challenges, which have been there in this space. And so our experience is that the most successful deployments of this kind of technology is to focus on one or two specific scenarios when information or data is going outside of the enterprise, or it's going to a cloud or to an unmanaged cloud service, or to comply with data privacy regulations and so on. Those are starting with a specific use case are the scenarios where we found this automation and this whole technology in general to be most successful. What's been your experience in this, Frank? You talk to far more number of enterprises than us.
It's interesting that you bring it up, because as I'm listening to the process and going through your conversation, I'm kind of thinking when you're on this slide, right, as we talk about what to protect and what to apply and how do we change policies, right? The one thing that keeps resonating in my head is that the amount of data that we're dealing with increases by about 24% a year. Now, 24%. So that really means we're looking at doubling the amount of data we're going to be dealing with every 2 to 3 years. And I kind of think about this like in a family scenario, right? You have one child and you're headstrong, and then you have a second child, and then you forget, and all of a sudden you have them. By the four children, it's exponentially harder to manage than one, right? That's what we're doing here. And so, I think if what the scenarios that I think are happening, and I call it the scorched earth scenario, which is we can't possibly protect anything. So we either don't allow you to use it, or sometimes we just destroy it. Like, we're worried that we've got PII out there. So what do? We just destroy all the data. That way we don't have a threat liability, because we see this exponentially problem. And if you're struggling with data security now, you're going to be struggling with it double next year. Vishal, I have to think there are people that came to you 2 years ago and go, hey, we kind of like your solution, but we don't think we need it. In 2 years, they come knock on your door. Hey, right? They really desperately tell me I'm lying.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a very, very common scenario. The first attempts for most people are manual. It's like trying to make a car manually versus putting an assembly line together. It's just you cannot scale that at all. Yeah. So we see that with large enterprises all the time, every day.
Yeah, I think that's the as we've gone through this thesis of automation, I'll talk about the elephant in the room, right? Because I'm the analyst, right? That's what I do. And the elephant in the room is that I'm almost certain there's nobody who's listening to this webcast right now that hasn't had a bad experience with some kind of data security implementation, right? I never forget talking to a CISO, actually it was a UTM vendor about 5 years ago, and he looked at me and he goes, Frank, somewhere between 35 and 70% of my clients buy DLP from me and don't turn it on. And I go, don't turn it on. How do you know that? And you go, well, because the UTM has got to call back for the update. And I go, well, what's happening? He goes, what happens is data security gets in the way. And even back then, 5 years ago, we were struggling with the scale and the issues, like having users self-identify and say what is valuable, implementing policies. And let's face it, like as we went to implement data security in the past, it was all about it was all about monitor. We put things in monitor mode because we didn't trust it, right? Because we had a bad experience. So it's funny because as we talk about automation, I really think, and Vishal, you'll probably disagree with me, and I'd be interested to get your opinions, but I don't necessarily know if the important thing is the automation. I think for me, the important thing is the analytics. It's the machine learning and the AI that allows us to do the identification of data at scale. And I think once you're able to curate things in almost real time, then the automation becomes much easier, right? It's the moving from the historical heuristic-based approaches of data classification, of data management, to something that's AI analytics based. That's something that's more deterministic that enables the automation, right? So it's almost, as we talk about this, we've summarized everything under automation. But for me, the value is first in the analytics and then in automating. Disagree?
Largely disagree, let's say. I think
Okay.
I think if you were to start with a clean slate and say there's an enterprise which has done no data security initiative, and you were to start from scratch today, yes, I would start with a discovery and classification exercise. Run that first, discover all the data, do the analytics, and then start protecting it. But most of the large enterprises have some kind of data security initiatives which are already there, and they are hurting, right? There is a here and now problem, and running a full-scale enterprise-wide data discovery process is likely to take months, sometimes years to complete. And till that time, this problem will continue. And the reality here is that discovery and classification by itself is a step towards solving the real problem, which is protection. It doesn't solve the problem. So if you've got data in one big bucket, and now through this process of discovery and classification, you are able to segregate data into 5 different buckets. So what? Right? I mean, that by itself is not the solution to any problem. It is what you are able to do differently with these buckets, right? Highly confidential data, you treat it differently, and public data, you treat it differently. And so what I believe is running these massive enterprise-wide discovery and classification projects takes away from solving the problem here and now, which is where a lot of times you already know what is the information which needs protection, what is the data that the enterprise is most like, the crown jewels, the enterprise is most at risk. So I would our suggestion always is to restrict the project to the most critical pieces of information, and to solve the problem not only of discovery but of protection and tracking, and then make it more iterate. Right? I don't think it's completely opposite to what you're saying. It is an important, the classification and discovery is an important part. It's just that enterprises are already somewhere along that journey, and it's easy to build on that and solve the problems. Right? So Frank, let me ask you a question here. You and I seem to be in love with data security and protection and so on. But do you consider this as a cure-all? What are the other elements of security that you think are important today for a security team to focus on?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I think there's that old metaphor, right? And the metaphor is, if you take a frog and you put it in a pot of water and you put it on the stove, and you turn it on, that the frog will boil to death because it doesn't notice the changes in the environment, right? And I bring up that metaphor because I think we've always had an issue with data security, but all of a sudden, when everybody went home, we go, oh my, like all my data just went home. Like to your point, all the corporate data is sitting on someone's endpoint at home, where maybe it's curated well, and maybe at night, my son is playing Minecraft on that exact same machine with my corporate data, right? So I think the thing about COVID is it created an awareness. It was interesting. We did a big primary study, and it was this happy accident. And so we released this survey 2 weeks before everyone went home in COVID. And so you think, oh boy, that's going to destroy your results. Well, it kind of did, but it also illuminated some results. We had some real-time results that you couldn't get. And it was the 2 weeks before everyone went home, people were concerned about things like ransomware, about data security. After they went home, the concern doubled. Now, ransomware didn't change overnight. Phishing didn't change overnight. We became aware of it. And so I apologize. I'm an analyst, very long-winded issue. So I think as we talk about data security right now, it's top of mind, right? Because we've all of a sudden we're shook and we realize, oh my gosh, my data, what differentiates me from my competitors, that materials company, right? They're an IP company. Everyone's an IP company. Now all of a sudden, my data is at home, and I just realized that. And I just realized that, hey, that data is not only living there, but it's not even living on-prem. It's in the cloud, and it's in IaaS, and it's SaaS, and it's in PaaS platforms. It's everywhere. So it's really a heightened issue. But I think if we step back, the way this issue of the importance of data security is a longer term path. And there was a document that I think I wrote actually in 2018. We talked about the looming new 4 control points, because this disappearing perimeter, it's not new. Like, it's accelerated because of COVID, but it's not new. And so we look at it in 4 big buckets of things you need to control. It's the endpoint, right? Let's be real. Everything happens on the endpoint. If you're going to implement some controls, it's going to happen at that interface point. It's the application, right? What is accessing the data? What are the controls? You talked about SAP. That's an application, right? Mm-hmm. We talked about identity, right? Because think about it. What is data security without an identity? The who is almost as important as the what. And then we talk about the data. So those are the 4 control points. And I think, yes, data security is important, but it's not more important than any of the others, and it's not less important than the others. Case in point, we talk about the role or the person, right? So when I come in, we want our HR system, right, to auto update Active Directory so that we have a very real time knowing what our roles are, because based on our role, then we can dynamically allow and disallow access to certain data. And as I move in the organization, as people reporting to me, I get different levels of finance access and HR access and proprietary data. Like, these all interact. And where do they interact? What good is all these data protections if my endpoint's not properly controlled? And if my applications or access is protected with a simple username and password, what good is data-centric security if that's what's going on in my application? So I think they're very long-winded. I think it's one of the 4 control points. It's not any more important than the other 4 points, but it's as important as all the 4. And maybe the important point is all 4 really need to work together. Agree?
And yeah, absolutely. For once, we agree.
Good. That's a good thing to agree on a webcast.
Absolutely. So endpoint, identity, application, and data, right? I think those are good takeaways for any security professional, right? And all of them are important, and it's more important to get them to work together. One of the questions that we at Seclore constantly get asked is, automation normally comes at the cost of reliability, right? And automation takes time to reach acceptable levels. For example, we don't yet see driverless cars because the technology for automating driving has still not matured to a point where it's safe enough, let's say, to put a car on the road. Do you think that the maturity of automation in this particular space of data security has reached prime time levels?
I think I think it has, right? And we talked about this a little bit earlier, right? Because for me, it's 2 parts. It's not only making things go faster. It's not about the automation, but it's the identification, right? It's being able to use analytics to be able to identify things accurately and at scale, right? Because if we think back, right, to this slide, end users have to decide. Well, if end users have to decide and data is increasing 24% a year, like that's a problem that end users aren't going to be able to solve. So the solution is automation or nothing, right? It's either allow or disallow. So realistically, I don't really think there's an alternative. But I think what we're seeing is the analytics and heuristics, I should say analytics and machine learning, are getting much and much better and more accurate about applying things at scale. And if you think about it, right, what's the alternative to automation? The alternative to automation is humans. And I guarantee you the automation is much more accurate than humans at identifying critical data to identify. Yes?
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think just breaking down the automation, right, there are two kinds of automation, right? One is deterministic and the second is heuristic, right? So there is a deterministic automation which renders tremendous value without compromising on reliability at all. So for example, if I already know, going back to the example I was giving for SAP, if I already know that general ledger data should be protected in a certain way, and I've encoded that into my SAP security policy, to be able to extend that security policy on data that is a report which comes out of SAP doesn't require any analysis, doesn't require AI, right? It is just pure integration between SAP's security policy and a data-centric security policy, right? And there's tremendous value in just being able to do this deterministic integration. The second part, which is more heuristic, more, where you have systems which learn and so on, I would agree that there is no option, because it is not a scenario of the car where you could teach a person to drive a car and he drives it. It is either you have a driverless car or you walk. Right? These are the only two options, right? Going back to what you said. So absolutely. I think we are going from stick shift to driverless. It's not really automatic cars. I don't think there may not be too many people who've driven stick shifts in this age, but I grew up on a stick, driving a stick shift. And from there, we are moving to driverless. Right?
Yeah, I think though the interesting point, Vishal, and I think you touched on it, but I think it's really important to highlight, because you talked about this issue in passing about integrations, about APIs, right? And as we think about automation, sometimes we talk about it like it's a massive amount of work. And if you think about half of the problem is almost, I don't want to say that APIs are ever easy, but just integrating systems sometimes gets you almost halfway there. Because if you think about my scenario, we talk about security. The first thing that I mentioned earlier was, hey, have the HR system integrate with Active Directory so that we automatically update and integrate the identity lifecycle. You talked about SAP. Once again, there's another integration of how do we integrate SAP with our Active Directory, with our HR system, with our DLP. And sometimes the automation really isn't necessarily automation. It's just integrating with the API. Let's get the integrations to work. That seems like it's half the problem. And I think sometimes we glance over the importance of integrations.
No, absolutely. And that's the deterministic part. And a lot of stuff can be done. A lot of this automation can be done without creating any sort of compromise on reliability. Absolutely. Just by integrating. Right, the HRMS and identity system integration that you talked about it's not rocket science at all. Right, it's totally deterministic. The HRMS system knows when a person leaves the company, it can trigger the identity system, which can then trigger a data-centric security system to automatically withdraw permissions for that person for all kinds of confidential data that he or she might have access to. Absolutely. So I have one last question for you, Frank, before we hand it back to Jill for, I think there are some audience questions also which have come in. If an enterprise is starting out on a data-centric security journey today, what potholes would you advise them to watch out for?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I'll try and make it quick because I'm looking at the Q&A bar and there's a lot. So I think you might be sticking around to answer questions after this. But I think for me the potholes are I might generally point to two, right? And the first one is probably all projects, not just data security projects, but data security projects and that there. And it's like you had a slide. Don't try and boil the ocean. And I would come up with the ancillary. Identify a particular pain point. Like identify, as you talked earlier, each one of your case studies, if you think about it, there was a particular pain point that we were dealing with. Identify a pain point so you're not trying to boil the ocean. Like you say, how many times we go, well, we'll try this top down. We'll try and discover all our data. And then we'll try to classify all our data, and then we'll try and implement, and before you know it, we're 3 years in and we don't have any wins yet, and then the CEOs get mad at us, right? Start with a particular pain point. Once you decide what your most critical pain point is, address it, solve it, and then all of a sudden, based on that learning, then attack pain point number 2 and pain point number 3. So you create this way to get some wins, but B, create the snowball effect. Because if you try and go big and solve everything, you get caught up in the weeds, right? Start small. This is my pain point. Solve that. Move to the next one. I think the second part, and I kind of touched on this earlier. I think data security's got a bad name, and I think it's got a bad name because, let's face it, some of the older technologies, they didn't all implement well. Like everybody's got a horror story about the first time they tried to implement DLP or IPS was a famous one, right? We installed IPS and it always tended to break something at 2:00 in the morning on a Saturday. Like always, like it. I don't know what it is about that time, but that's when it always breaks. And so I think as we look at, yes, digital transformation has created more data, but I really think we have to relook at using these digital transformation technologies and apply it to the problem. So not only is it creating the problem, but it's creating a solution. So I think coming into it with an open mind, I think is extremely important.
Very valuable insights, Frank. It's such a pleasure talking to as always. Jill, I'm going to hand it back to you. I think there are a lot of questions. We might be able to cover a few. I'll let you pick.
Okay, great. And I got to say, just listening to the interaction back and forth between you, I'm sure the audience feels the same way, but I could sit and listen to you guys banter back and forth all afternoon. Really great info. And I love the debates. Journalists love debates. So
be careful what you ask for.
Yeah. So the first one that came in here, I believe this one is for Frank, and it says, what are some of the biggest reasons that data protection initiatives fail? That's a big question right there.
Wow. Boy, that relates to kind of the question Vishal just asked. It's the flip side, right? Where are the pitfalls? I think, why do they fail? I think the biggest reason I think they fail is they try to do too much too fast, right? It's that's whole boil the ocean mentality. I think if I think it's really important to pick outcomes, right? Because so often in security we tend to focus on problems, or we try to focus on product, right? And we don't focus on outcomes. So I think if you redefine the problem, focusing on what is the outcome I'm looking to create and then work backwards. I think that's important. So I think for me, that's the number one reason, especially in data security, because we both Vishal and I touched on it differently. It's that we've all seen organizations which try to do, massive data discovery across, multiple geographies, and but by the time they get to data classification and then they get to introducing something, technology's all changed, right? The problem is moving so fast. So I think that would be my first one. The second one, I just think in today's day and age, it's all about automation. You've got to fundamentally change the way you're approaching. Automation is key to be able to do things in scale. And it's not just in data-centric security. We're talking about automation across all data security, right? The integration of CASB and DLP and encryption and data security, right? These are all things that work together. And so integration, automation, think of outcomes and creating solutions rather than point products. I think those would be my big ones.
Great. And a little follow-up there is, in one of your slides, you had talked about areas which require help within data security, and it looked like everything needs help. With shortage of security personnel and resources, how do CISOs cope with the pressure of keeping the lights on and doing data protection initiatives, especially in this last year that we've just gone through, I would say?
Yeah, it's getting worse, right? Because when we talk about it's important to note the macro trends, right? And as we talk about the macro trends, we talk about digital transformation. That's a big macro trend. The interjection of data, that's a macro trend. The other macro trends that are probably really important. The threat landscape is getting worse, right? I mean, just think about the life cycle of ransomware. It was spray and pray ransomware, and now all of a sudden we're including, remote access Trojans as part of that ransomware so that we can look throughout your organization. We can, exfiltrate data, then we encrypt, and then we extort you saying, hey, not only we're going to charge you to give you your data back, we're going to charge you to not give it to your competitors. Like, it's just crazy. But the fourth one I think is most important, as we look at the growth of data, right? And we say it's growing at 24% a year, which means the need to protect that data is going to roughly grow 24% a year. The universities aren't turning out skilled cybersecurity professionals at a rate of increasing 24% a year. Like, the people aren't scaling. There's just not enough of them. Even if you had infinite amount of resources, Vishal talked about it in that one instance where you had almost 1 million alerts daily. Like, you can't hire enough people. So, as I talk to CISOs, the number one thing I tell them is you need to change your metrics for measuring success. And that metrics need to be in terms of people. What is the impact that you're looking to have on people? So if you're going to implement a data security solution, and part of implementing your data security solution is you're going to require 10 more people, that's a bad path, right? You need to look at it in terms of, how do I alleviate problems? How do I reduce the number of alerts? How do I implement the scale? How do I reduce the manual? So I think very much, as I counsel CISOs, I think about don't implement technologies, look to create outcomes. And when you're looking to create those outcomes, measure those outcomes with the people ROI. Vishal, you talk to people regularly. Do you agree? Is that what your customers are saying?
I would also, besides, yes, completely agree. I would just add that what is happening also to help is that a lot of workloads and with responsibilities moving to the cloud, enterprises are also moving some of that over to the cloud service providers, right? So a lot of the application security initiatives, infrastructure security initiatives, right? It's going over to the cloud. So that is helping. But I would, agree. Automation automation can help in reducing that gap between availability of skilled resources and the demand, right? That those are two big things that are happening. So yeah,
the one thing
agree.
The one thing I'd add, in as you talk about moving things to the cloud, like the other maybe short term thing I always focus on is integrations, right? We talked about APIs earlier. The important to integrate, because a lot of times you can simplify things and create some really great wins through integration. The problem with the cloud that I struggle with a little bit, and we're saying, hey, we're moving things to the cloud to help with that people problem. The reality is, especially large enterprises, they don't move to the cloud. They move to clouds. And sometimes what they do is they create their own problem. I mean, Vishal, your business is solving the problems that they create. So because they don't move to like one cloud, they move to 5 clouds. And like now all of a sudden the data management problem grows exponentially. So that might be one thing I would say. Once again, measuring everything in people.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are, just to give you an idea, we are by no means a large company, and definitely not in the 100,000 people range. But even at our scale, we use about 45 different cloud services, right? From Salesforce to Microsoft and we're a small company. I mean, mid-sized company, let's say, and we ourselves use 45 different cloud services, from marketing automation to Salesforce to CRM to the ERP system to Microsoft, of course, to Zoom and so on. It's just impossible to keep track. Yeah, so it is a big problem, and it just multiplies exponentially. Back to you, Jill.
Terrific. Well, great conversation. I'm sure we would have plenty more questions to answer if we only had a bit more time, but I want to thank the audience for listening in, and I want to thank you both for just a really terrific conversation. I also want to make sure everyone knows this will be available on demand, so if anyone has any interest in listening back to some of this great conversation, you certainly can do so, and you can forward it on to other folks so that they can take a listen as well. Thank you both so much for participating.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks, Jill. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.